Bride of the Silent Forest. Talia Corvin had spent her life pretending she was just like everyone else, ignoring the whispers that said otherwise. But on the night of the equinox, the horn sounded. The mist thickened. And when she ran, he was already there golden-eyed, watching her with something unreadable. "You were marked for the hunt," he murmured, voice dark as the storm rolling in. "And I am the one who will take you." Chapter 1. The Whispers of Eventide. The late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows from the ancient oaks that lined the edges of Talia Corvin's garden. At 58, Talia had cultivated a life as carefully tended as her rose bushes, predictable, orderly, and blissfully solitary. The small town of Havenwood, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, was her sanctuary, a place where she could almost believe the whispers of her past were just the wind rustling through the leaves. Almost. She snipped a particularly vibrant bloom, a deep crimson rose that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The scent, rich and heady, filled her senses, a fleeting distraction from the unease that had settled in her bones. The autumnal equinox was approaching, a day she had always dreaded, though she'd long ago buried the reason why deep in the recesses of her mind. Talia had moved to Havenwood 20 years ago, after the death of her husband, Daniel. He had been a kind, steady man, a grounding force in her otherwise turbulent life. His passing had left a void, but also a sense of relief she was ashamed to admit. He had never known the truth about her, the secrets she guarded with a ferocity born of fear. She placed the rose in a small vase on her kitchen table, the worn oak surface a testament to years of quiet meals and solitary evenings. The house itself was old, a charmingly dilapidated Victorian with a wraparound porch and a garden that seemed to spill over with untamed beauty. It was a reflection of her outwardly serene, inwardly a tangled mess of thorns and hidden blooms. The whispers started again, a faint, almost imperceptible hum that vibrated in the air, in her very blood. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the frantic beat of her heart. It was always worse this time of year. The thinning of the veil, her grandmother used to call it. A time when the boundaries between worlds blurred, when the past reached out with grasping claws. Talia had tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just the onset of menopause, the creeping anxieties of age. But the dreams had returned, vivid and terrifying, filled with images of running through moonlit forests, the baying of hounds echoing in the distance, a pair of golden eyes watching her from the shadows. She poured herself a glass of wine, a crisp Sauvignon Blanc, and walked out onto the porch. The air was growing cooler, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The sky was a canvas of fiery oranges and purples, a breathtaking spectacle that failed to soothe her growing apprehension. Her neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, a sprightly woman in her 70s with a penchant for gossip and a surprisingly green thumb, waved from across the street. "Beautiful evening, Talia," she called out, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze. "It is," Talia replied, forcing a smile. "Enjoying the last of the warm weather?" "Trying to," Mrs. Abernathy said, her brow furrowing. "Though there's a strange feelin' in the air, don't you think? Like something's brewin'." Talia's grip tightened on her wine glass. "Just the change of seasons, I imagine." Mrs. Abernathy chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Maybe. But my bones tell me different. They always do, you know. Especially around the equinox." Talia managed a noncommittal murmur and retreated back inside, the conversation unsettling her more than she cared to admit. Mrs. Abernathy, with her uncanny intuition and unsettlingly accurate predictions, was a reminder that some things couldn't be ignored, no matter how hard one tried. She finished her wine, the alcohol doing little to calm her nerves. The whispers were growing louder now, a chorus of voices murmuring just beyond the edge of hearing. She closed her eyes, trying to block them out, but they seeped into her consciousness, weaving themselves into her thoughts. "Run," they urged. "Hide." She opened her eyes, her gaze drawn to the old, leather-bound journal that sat on her bookshelf. It was her grandmother's, filled with strange stories and cryptic entries, a legacy Talia had tried to dismiss as the ramblings of an eccentric old woman. But tonight, she felt an undeniable pull towards it, a desperate need to understand the source of her fear. With trembling hands, she took the journal from the shelf, the leather cool and smooth beneath her fingertips. Dust motes danced in the fading light as she opened it, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The script was elegant and flowing, a stark contrast to the unsettling content. She flipped through the pages, stopping at an entry marked with the date of the autumnal equinox, many years ago. The words seemed to jump out at her, chilling her to the bone. The hunt begins at twilight. The marked ones will be drawn to the ancient grounds. There is no escape. The wild hunt claims its due. Talia slammed the journal shut, her heart pounding in her chest. It was just a story, a fairy tale. It had to be. But the whispers, the dreams, the growing sense of dread, they all pointed to a truth she had spent her life trying to deny. The sound of distant horns, mournful and haunting, echoed through the valley. Talia froze, her blood turning to ice. It couldn't be. It was just the wind, a trick of the ear. But deep down, she knew. The hunt had begun. The mist began to roll in. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Mist. The mist was unnatural, a thick, swirling blanket that seemed to devour the twilight, clinging to the ground and obscuring the familiar landscape. It wasn't the gentle, rolling fog that sometimes graced Havenwood in the autumn. This was something else, something colder, heavier, imbued with a palpable sense of dread. Talia stood on her porch, the leather-bound journal clutched in her hand, her breath catching in her throat. The horns sounded again, closer this time, their mournful cries sending shivers down her spine. She wanted to dismiss it, to retreat back into the safety of her home, to lock the doors and pretend this wasn't happening. But the whispers, now a cacophony of voices, wouldn't let her. They surged through her, a primal instinct screaming at her to flee. Run, Talia. Run. Her legs moved before her mind could fully process the command. She stumbled down the porch steps, her heart hammering against her ribs, the cool night air stinging her lungs. The mist swirled around her, disorienting her, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of her. She had no destination in mind, only a desperate need to escape, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the source of the horns. The familiar streets of Havenwood seemed alien in the mist, the houses looming like ghostly shapes, their windows dark and uninviting. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the rhythmic thud of her own footsteps and the distant, insistent call of the horns. She ran blindly, guided by instinct, her senses heightened, every nerve ending on high alert. The scent of pine and damp earth filled her nostrils, mingling with a strange, musky odor she couldn't quite place. It was both familiar and unsettling, stirring something deep within her, a primal fear she had long suppressed. She stumbled, her foot catching on a gnarled root, and nearly fell. She caught herself on a nearby tree, her hand scraping against the rough bark. The tree was ancient, its branches reaching up into the mist like skeletal fingers. It felt strangely alive, pulsing with a subtle energy that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. As she pushed herself upright, she saw a flicker of movement in the periphery of her vision. A shadow, darker than the surrounding mist, shifting and swirling, taking on a vaguely humanoid form. She froze, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes straining to pierce the gloom. The shadow moved again, closer this time, and she could make out the glint of golden eyes, burning with an unnatural intensity. They were the eyes from her dreams, the eyes that had haunted her for years. Terror, raw and overwhelming, seized her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her limbs felt like lead, her voice trapped in her throat. She was paralyzed, caught in the gaze of the hunter, the creature from her nightmares. The shadow solidified, taking on the form of a man tall, powerfully built, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders and features that were both strikingly handsome and undeniably dangerous. He was dressed in clothing that seemed out of time, leather and fur, like something from a historical drama. But there was nothing theatrical about him. He radiated an aura of raw power, of untamed wildness, that made her skin crawl. He moved with a grace that was both animalistic and mesmerizing, closing the distance between them in a few swift strides. He stopped just a few feet away, his golden eyes fixed on her, their intensity unwavering. She could smell him now, that strange, musky scent, amplified, intoxicating. It was the scent of the wild, of the forest, of something ancient and untamed. It was the scent of a predator. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with an unnerving scrutiny, as if he could see straight through her, to the secrets she had guarded for so long. His lips, full and sensual, curved into a slight, almost imperceptible smile that did nothing to reassure her. "You are marked for the hunt," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. It was a voice that held both a threat and a promise, a voice that sent shivers down her spine. The sound resonated with the whispers, an echo of something older than time. "And I am the one who will take you." The words, spoken with such quiet certainty, shattered the last vestiges of her denial. This was real. The hunt was real. And she was the prey. Her carefully constructed world, her meticulously crafted facade of normalcy, crumbled around her, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She wanted to run, and a choked sound escaped her. Chapter 3. The Hunter's Gaze. The choked sound, a strangled gasp of fear and disbelief, hung in the cold, misty air. Talia's mind raced, desperately trying to reconcile the reality before her with the life she had so carefully constructed. This couldn't be happening. This was the stuff of nightmares, of ancient legends, not the quiet, predictable existence she had carved out for herself in Havenwood. The man, the hunter, didn't move. He remained standing there, a statue of dark power and unsettling beauty, his golden eyes fixed on her with that unnerving intensity. He seemed to be waiting, giving her a moment to absorb the reality of the situation, to understand the futility of resistance. "Who are you?" Talia finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling, barely audible above the rustling of the mist. He tilted his head slightly, that small, enigmatic smile still playing on his lips. "You know who I am, Talia Corvin. You've felt me in your dreams, in your blood, in the whispers that haunt you." The use of her full name, spoken with such familiarity, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. How could he know her name? How could he know about her dreams, her whispers? I don't understand," she stammered, her mind struggling to grasp the impossible. This isn't real." He took a step closer, his presence filling her senses, the musky scent of him intensifying, a heady mix of pine, earth, and something wilder, something that stirred a primal fear deep within her. "It is more real than anything you've ever known," he said, his voice low and resonant, a stark contrast to the frantic beat of her heart. "The hunt is an ancient tradition, a sacred duty. And you, Talia, are bound to it, whether you understand it or not." "Bound?" she repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Bound to what?" "To you?" He chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that sent shivers down her spine. "To the hunt, to the wild, to your true nature." His words struck a chord, resonating with something deep within her, something she had spent her life trying to suppress. The whispers, the dreams, the feeling of being different, of not belonging, it all made a terrifying kind of sense. "My true nature?" she questioned, her voice barely a whisper. I don't have a true nature." He raised an eyebrow, his gaze piercing. "Don't you?" "You deny the whispers, you suppress the instincts, but they are there, Talia. They are a part of you, as much as your heart, your lungs, your very soul." He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face. She flinched, instinctively recoiling from his touch, but he didn't press. He simply held his hand there, a silent invitation, a silent challenge. "You feel it, don't you?" he murmured, his voice softer now, almost hypnotic. "The pull of the wild, the call of the hunt. It's in your blood, Talia." It's in your heritage. She closed her eyes, trying to block out his words, his presence, the overwhelming sense of dread that threatened to consume her. But it was no use. She did feel it, a strange, unsettling energy coursing through her veins, a primal instinct awakening within her. She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. There was no escaping him, no escaping this. He was a part of her destiny, a dark and terrifying figure who held the key to her past, her present, and her future. What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling, but with a newfound strength, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. His smile widened, a hint of something that might have been admiration in his golden gaze. "I want you to embrace your true nature, Talia. I want you to run with me. I want you to experience the thrill of the hunt." The thought was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. The idea of surrendering to the wild, of embracing the darkness within her, was both repulsive and strangely alluring. "And if I refuse?" she challenged, her voice still trembling, but her chin lifted in defiance. His smile faded, his eyes hardening, the warmth replaced by a chilling intensity. "There is no refusal, Talia. You are marked. You are mine. The hunt has begun, and it will not end until I claim you." The mist swirled faster, the horns silent. He was waiting. Chapter 4. Marked for the hunt. The chilling finality in his voice, the unwavering certainty in his golden eyes, left Talia with a sense of utter helplessness.
Marked. Meaning?
The words echoed in her mind, branding her, claiming her. She was trapped, caught in a web of ancient forces she didn't understand, with no escape in sight. "What does it mean to be marked?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze searching his face for any hint of mercy, any sign of weakness. But there was none. He was implacable, a force of nature, as inevitable as the rising tide. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, the scent of him overwhelming her senses. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the raw power that emanated from him in waves. It was both terrifying and strangely intoxicating. "It means you belong to the hunt," he said, his voice low and resonant, his breath warm on her face. "It means you are connected to the wild, to the ancient ways. It means your blood sings with a power you have yet to understand." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She flinched at his touch, her skin prickling with a strange mixture of fear and something else. Something she couldn't quite name, something that both repelled and attracted her. "It means you are different, Talia," he continued, his voice softening, almost seductive. "You are not like the others in this town, these mortals. You have a fire in your soul, a wildness in your heart that cannot be tamed." His words resonated with a truth she had spent her life denying. She had always felt different, out of place, like she didn't belong. She had suppressed those feelings, buried them deep, but they were always there, simmering beneath the surface. "But I don't want to be different," she whispered, her voice trembling, tears welling up in her eyes. "I just want to be normal, to live a normal life." He chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Normal is an illusion, Talia. A cage built by those who fear what they don't understand. You are meant for more than that. You are meant for the wild, for the freedom of the hunt." He removed his hand from her face, but his gaze remained locked on hers, holding her captive. She felt like a deer caught in the headlights, paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to think. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible, her body trembling. "Now," he said, his smile returning, a flash of white teeth in the darkness, "we run." He turned and started to walk away, into the thickest part of the mist, his form disappearing and reappearing, like a phantom. He didn't look back, didn't wait for her. He simply expected her to follow. Talia stood there for a moment, her mind reeling, her body frozen. She could stay, try to find her way back to her house, to her carefully constructed life. But she knew it was futile. He had said she was marked, that she belonged to the hunt. There was no escaping him, no escaping her destiny. A strange sense of inevitability washed over her, a feeling of surrender, of acceptance. She was afraid, terrified, but there was also a flicker of something else, a spark of excitement, a thrill of anticipation. The wild, the hunt, it was calling to her, a siren song she could no longer resist. She took a deep breath, the cold, misty air filling her lungs, and started to follow him. Her footsteps were hesitant at first, but with each step, her stride became more confident, her movements more fluid. She was running, not away from him, but towards him, towards the unknown, towards the darkness that awaited her. The mist swirled around her, obscuring her path, but she didn't care. She could feel him ahead of her, a guiding presence, a dark beacon in the night. She could hear the rustling of his clothes, the faint thud of his footsteps, the rhythm of his breathing. She was running, and for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. The fear was still there, but it was mingled with a sense of liberation, of exhilaration. She was shedding her old life, her old self, and embracing something new, something wild, something terrifying, something inevitable. The forest grew darker around her. Chapter 5. Flight into Darkness. The forest pressed in, the trees looming like silent sentinels, their branches intertwined overhead, blocking out the last vestiges of twilight. The mist thickened, swirling around Talia like a living entity, clinging to her clothes, her hair, her skin. She could barely see a few feet in front of her, but she continued to run, her senses hyper-alert, guided by the faint sounds of the hunter ahead of her. The ground was uneven, covered in a thick carpet of decaying leaves and gnarled roots, making it difficult to maintain her footing. She stumbled several times, her hands scraping against the rough ground, but she pushed herself up, her determination fueled by a mixture of fear and a growing sense of something else. Something akin to exhilaration. The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of pine, wet earth, and the hunter's unique, musky aroma. It was a scent that both repelled and attracted her, stirring something primal within her, a wildness she had long suppressed. She could hear him ahead of her, his movements swift and silent, like a predator stalking its prey. He didn't speak, didn't offer any words of encouragement or comfort. He simply led the way, expecting her to follow, to keep up. And she did. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning, her muscles aching, her body protesting, but she refused to give in. She was running, not just from the hunt, but from her old life, from the constraints she had placed upon herself, from the fear that had held her captive for so long. She realized she was no longer in the familiar woods surrounding Havenwood. The trees were taller, older, their branches gnarled and twisted, their roots reaching deep into the earth. The air felt different, heavier, charged with a strange energy that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She caught a glimpse of him through the mist, a fleeting shadow, his dark hair flowing behind him, his movements fluid and graceful, like a wild animal. He was moving at an incredible pace, yet he seemed to be barely exerting himself. She wondered who he was, this mysterious hunter, this creature of the night. What was his name? What was his story? Why had he chosen her? The questions swirled in her mind, but she knew she wouldn't get any answers. Not yet. She focused on the rhythm of her breathing, on the pounding of her heart, on the sensation of her feet hitting the ground. She was running, and she was free. Free from the confines of her small town, her small life, her small self. She didn't know where she was going, or what awaited her, but she knew she couldn't go back. She had crossed a threshold, stepped into a different world, a world of magic and mystery, of danger and darkness. She was starting to feel the effects of the run, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her muscles screaming in protest. She was not used to this level of exertion, her life having been one of quiet routine and gentle exercise. She stumbled again, her foot catching on a root, and this time she fell, landing hard on the damp earth. She cried out, pain shooting through her ankle. She tried to get up, but a sharp, searing pain prevented her. She lay there for a moment, her breath catching in her throat, tears of pain and frustration welling up in her eyes. She was exhausted, injured, and alone in the darkness. She had failed. She heard his footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, like a predator circling its wounded prey. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for whatever was to come. He stopped beside her, his shadow falling over her, blocking out the faint light that filtered through the mist. She could feel his presence, his power, his heat. She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. His golden eyes were filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that looked almost like respect. He knelt down, his movements surprisingly gentle. Chapter 6. The Scent of Pine and Storm. The hunter knelt beside her, the movement surprisingly fluid and graceful for a man of his size and power. The mist swirled around him, making him seem almost ethereal, a creature of myth and legend. The scent of him, that potent mix of pine, damp earth, and something wilder, intensified, filling her senses, overriding the sharp pain in her ankle. He didn't speak, didn't offer any words of comfort or reassurance. He simply looked at her, his golden eyes searching her face, assessing the damage. His gaze was intense, unnerving, yet there was a hint of something else in their depths, a flicker of concern that surprised her. Talia lay there, her breath catching in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. She was vulnerable, injured, and completely at his mercy. She should be terrified, yet a strange sense of calm had settled over her. She was still afraid, but the fear was tempered by a growing curiosity, a fascination with this enigmatic creature who had turned her life upside down. He reached out, his hand hovering over her injured ankle. She flinched, instinctively recoiling from his touch, but he didn't press. He simply held his hand there, waiting for her to accept his help. "It hurts," she whispered, her voice trembling, her gaze locked on his. He nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly gentle. "Let me see." She hesitated for a moment, her mind warring with her instincts. Trusting him was dangerous, foolish, yet she had no other choice. She was helpless, alone in the darkness, and he was her only hope. She slowly nodded, giving him her permission. He gently took her ankle in his hand, his touch surprisingly warm and firm. She winced as he probed the injury, his fingers moving with a practiced ease that suggested he had experience with this sort of thing. "It's not broken," he said, his voice reassuring. "Just a sprain. But a bad one." He looked up at her, his golden eyes meeting hers. "You won't be able to run," he stated, the words matter-of-fact, devoid of any judgment or accusation. She closed her eyes, shame and frustration washing over her. She had failed, not only the hunt, but herself. She had been so close to escaping, to embracing the wildness within her. But now what happens now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes still closed. She felt him shift beside her, his body moving closer. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the scent of him enveloping her, a comforting presence in the cold, dark forest. "Now," he said, his voice a low murmur, close to her ear, "I take care of you." She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. His expression was serious, determined, yet there was a tenderness in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. It was a look that both unnerved and reassured her. He reached into a pouch at his belt, pulling out a small, leather-bound flask and a roll of cloth. He uncorked the flask, and the scent of herbs and something stronger, something akin to whiskey, filled the air. "This will help with the pain," he said, offering her the flask. She hesitated for a moment, then took the flask, her fingers brushing against his. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a strange, unsettling sensation that made her heart skip a beat. She took a small sip, the liquid burning its way down her throat, warming her from the inside out. It was potent, but effective, the pain in her ankle easing slightly. He then tore a strip of cloth from the roll and gently wrapped it around her ankle, his movements careful and precise. He worked in silence, his focus entirely on the task at hand, his touch surprisingly gentle and reassuring. As he worked, she studied his face, illuminated by the faint light filtering through the mist. He was undeniably handsome, his features strong and defined, his dark hair falling around his face, framing his golden eyes. He looked younger than she had initially thought, perhaps in his late 30s, though there was an ageless quality about him, a sense of ancient wisdom that belied his youthful appearance. He finished wrapping her ankle, securing the cloth with a knot. He looked up at her, his gaze meeting hers. "Better?" he asked, his voice soft, his eyes searching her face. She nodded, a small, hesitant smile touching her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, the words sincere, heartfelt. He returned her smile, a flash of white teeth in the darkness. It was a smile that transformed his face, making him seem less intimidating, more human. But the sound of a twig snapping changed everything. Chapter 7. Shackles of the Past. The sharp crack of a twig snapping underfoot shattered the fragile peace that had settled between them. Talia's heart leaped into her throat, the momentary respite from fear instantly replaced by a surge of adrenaline. The hunter's head snapped up, his golden eyes narrowing, his body tensing, every muscle coiled and ready for action. He was instantly transformed, the gentle healer replaced by the alert, dangerous predator. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low, guttural growl, devoid of any warmth. He rose to his feet in one fluid motion, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife sheathed at his hip. Talia wanted to protest, to ask what was happening, but the look on his face silenced her. He was focused, intense, his senses on high alert, scanning the surrounding darkness. The mist swirled around him, making him seem almost like a phantom, a creature of the night blending seamlessly into the shadows. She watched him, her heart pounding in her chest, her injured ankle throbbing. She was terrified, but also strangely fascinated. This was the hunter in his element, the wild, untamed creature she had glimpsed in her dreams. He moved with a silent grace, gliding through the trees, his footsteps barely making a sound on the damp earth. He disappeared into the mist, leaving Talia alone in the darkness, her senses straining to pick up any sign of danger. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the rustling of the leaves and the distant hooting of an owl. The mist pressed in, thick and suffocating, making it difficult to breathe. She felt exposed, vulnerable, a sitting duck for whatever lurked in the shadows. She clutched the leather-bound journal to her chest, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. "The hunt begins at twilight. The marked ones will be drawn to the ancient grounds. There is no escape. The wild hunt claims its due." The journal felt heavy in her hands, a tangible link to her past, to the heritage she had tried to ignore. It was a reminder that she was not just Talia Corvin, the quiet widow of Havenwood, but something more, something connected to the ancient ways, to the wild, to the hunt. She opened the journal, her fingers tracing the faded ink, her eyes scanning the familiar words. She needed to understand, to find some clue, some explanation for what was happening. She flipped through the pages, stopping at a passage she had read before, but this time, it resonated with a new meaning, a deeper understanding. The wild hunt is not merely a chase, but a test. A trial of strength, courage, and will. Those who are marked must embrace their true nature, or be consumed by it. Embrace her true nature, the words echoed in her mind, a challenge, a warning. She had spent her life suppressing her instincts, denying the whispers, trying to fit into a world where she didn't belong. But now, she was being forced to confront her heritage, to face the darkness within her. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She needed to be strong, to be courageous, to embrace the wildness that was stirring within her. She couldn't let fear consume her. She heard a sound, a faint rustling in the trees, closer this time. She tensed, her eyes snapping open, her hand reaching for the small, silver knife she always carried in her pocket, a gift from Daniel. It was a flimsy weapon, but it was all she had. The rustling grew louder, closer, and then a figure emerged from the mist. It was not the hunter, but another man, dressed in similar clothing, leather and fur, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating intensity. He held a crossbow in his hands, the weapon pointed directly at her. "Well, well," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "Looks like the bait worked." Talia's blood ran cold. Chapter 8. Beneath a Cursed Moon. Talia's blood ran cold, a chilling wave of dread washing over her.
Bait.
The word echoed in her mind, a horrifying realization that shattered any lingering illusions she might have had about the hunter's intentions. She had been used, manipulated, a pawn in some twisted game she didn't understand. The man with the crossbow stepped closer, his eyes fixed on her, their expression cold and devoid of any mercy. He was older than the hunter, his face weathered and lined, his hair streaked with gray. He exuded an aura of menace, of cruelty, that made her skin crawl. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice harsh and grating, the crossbow unwavering. "Or I'll put a bolt through you." Talia froze, her body trembling, her mind racing. She was trapped, injured, and completely at his mercy. She had nowhere to run, no way to defend herself. Her small silver knife felt pathetically inadequate against the crossbow.
Who are you?"
She stammered, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze darting around, desperately searching for any sign of the hunter. But he was nowhere to be seen. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Names are irrelevant," he said. "Let's just say I'm a collector." "Of sorts." He took another step closer, his eyes gleaming with a predatory intensity. She could smell him now, a foul odor of sweat and stale tobacco, a stark contrast to the hunter's clean, wild scent. "And you, little bird," he continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "are a very rare specimen. A descendant of the Corvin line. A true child of the wild." The mention of her family name sent a jolt of recognition through her. The Corvin line, her grandmother's stories, the whispers, it was all connected. What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling, but with a newfound strength, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. He smiled, a cruel, twisted smile that revealed yellowed teeth. "I want what's rightfully mine," he said. "The power that flows through your veins. The power of the hunt." He gestured with a crossbow towards the sky, where the moon, a pale, spectral orb, hung suspended in the misty sky. It was a full moon, its light casting an eerie glow over the forest, illuminating the scene with a strange, otherworldly quality. "Tonight is a special night," he continued, his voice taking on a fanatical edge. "The night of the cursed moon. A night when the veil between worlds is at its thinnest. A night when the power of the hunt is at its peak." He lowered the crossbow, aiming it directly at her heart. "And I intend to claim that power," he said, his eyes burning with a mad intensity. "By sacrificing you." Talia's breath caught in her throat. Sacrifice, the word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. She was going to die, here in this dark, cursed forest, a victim of some ancient ritual she didn't understand. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. She thought of Daniel, of her quiet life in Havenwood, of the roses she would never tend again. A single tear rolled down her cheek. Suddenly, a roar shattered the silence, a primal scream of rage that shook the very ground beneath her feet. The man with the crossbow stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror. Talia opened her eyes, her gaze following his, and saw him, the hunter, transformed. He was no longer the man she had met, the gentle healer. He was something else, something wilder, something more terrifying. His eyes glowed with an unearthly light, his teeth were elongated into fangs, his hands were tipped with claws. He was a creature of nightmare, a werewolf, his form shifting and changing, caught between man and beast. He lunged, a blur of motion. Chapter 9. The Unveiling of Secrets. The hunter lunged, a blur of motion, a terrifying spectacle of raw power and untamed fury. The crossbowman, caught completely off guard, barely had time to react before the hunter was upon him. The air filled with the sounds of snarling, the sickening thud of impact, and the man's strangled cry of pain. Talia watched in horrified fascination, her body frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend the scene unfolding before her. The hunter, her hunter, was a werewolf, a creature of myth and legend, and he was tearing the crossbowman apart with savage ferocity. The fight was brutal and swift. The crossbowman, despite his initial advantage, was no match for the hunter's supernatural strength and speed. The hunter ripped and tore, his claws and fangs sinking into flesh and bone, his roars echoing through the silent forest. Talia wanted to look away, to close her eyes and block out the gruesome spectacle, but she couldn't. She was transfixed, caught in the grip of a primal fear and a strange, unsettling fascination. This was the wild, the untamed power that flowed through her own veins, the heritage she had tried to deny. Within minutes, it was over. The crossbowman lay broken and bleeding on the ground, his life extinguished. The hunter stood over him, his chest heaving, his body covered in blood, his golden eyes still glowing with an unearthly light. He was a terrifying sight, a creature of nightmare, yet there was a strange beauty in his savagery, a raw, untamed power that both repelled and attracted her. He slowly turned his head, his gaze meeting Talia's. She flinched, instinctively recoiling from his gaze, expecting to see rage, bloodlust, but instead, she saw something else. Something that looked almost like remorse. The transformation began to reverse, his features shifting and softening, his claws retracting, his fangs receding. He was becoming human again, the gentle healer returning, but the memory of the beast remained, etched in Talia's mind. He staggered towards her, his body trembling, his breathing ragged. He collapsed to his knees beside her, his hand reaching out to touch her face, his fingers stained with blood. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse and strained, the words barely a whisper. Talia stared at him, her mind reeling, her emotions in turmoil. She was terrified, repulsed, yet also strangely drawn to him. He had saved her life, protected her, but he was also a monster, a creature of darkness. What are you?" she stammered, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his face. He closed his eyes, his head bowed, his body shaking with exhaustion and the aftermath of the transformation. "I am what you are," he said, his voice barely audible. "A descendant of the ancient ones. A child of the wild. A werewolf." The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. A werewolf. It was a word she had only read in books, in her grandmother's journal, a word she had dismissed as fantasy. But now, it was reality, a terrifying and undeniable truth.
"And the hunt?"
she questioned, her voice trembling, her mind struggling to grasp the implications. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. His eyes were no longer glowing, but they still held a hint of the wild, a flicker of the beast within. "The hunt is real," he said, his voice low and resonant. "It is a part of our heritage, a sacred duty. We are the guardians of the balance, the protectors of the wild." He paused, his gaze searching her face, as if trying to gauge her reaction, her understanding. "But there are those," he continued, his voice hardening, his eyes flashing with anger, "who seek to exploit the power of the hunt, to use it for their own selfish purposes. Like him." He gestured towards the dead crossbowman. "They are the hunters of the hunters. They are our enemies." He looked at her with a new intensity, his hand gripping hers so tightly. "And they want you, Talia." Chapter 10. A bond forged in fear. "They want you, Talia." The hunter's words, stark and chilling, hung in the cold night air, a heavy weight settling on Talia's already burdened heart. The revelation of his true nature, the brutal violence she had just witnessed, and now the knowledge that she was a target, hunted not just by him, but by others, more dangerous and ruthless. It was almost too much to bear. She stared at him, her mind reeling, her emotions a chaotic mix of fear, confusion, and a strange, unsettling sense of connection. He was a monster, a werewolf, a creature of nightmare, yet he had saved her life, protected her from a fate worse than death. He was her predator, but also her protector.
Why?
She whispered, her voice trembling, her gaze searching his face. Why me? What makes me so special? He sighed, his shoulders slumping, the exhaustion of the transformation and the weight of his words evident in his posture. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the lifeless body of the crossbowman, a grim reminder of the danger that surrounded them. It's your bloodline, he said, his voice low and strained. The Corvin line. You are a direct descendant of one of the first werewolves, one of the most powerful. Your blood, it holds a unique power, a connection to the wild that is stronger than most. He turned back to her, his golden eyes meeting hers, their intensity unwavering. They believe that by sacrificing you, by spilling your blood under the cursed moon, they can harness that power, amplify their own abilities, and unleash something ancient and terrible upon the world. Talia's breath caught in her throat. The implications of his words were horrifying. She was not just a target, but a key, a weapon to be used in some twisted ritual that threatened to unleash chaos and destruction. But I don't feel any power, she protested, her voice weak and uncertain. I'm just me, an ordinary woman. He smiled, a sad, knowing smile that did little to reassure her. You may not feel it yet, Talia, but it's there, dormant, waiting to be awakened. And they will do everything in their power to awaken it, to exploit it. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his touch surprisingly warm and comforting despite the blood that still stained his fingers. That's why I'm here, he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. To protect you. To help you understand your heritage, your power. To prepare you for what's to come. Talia's heart skipped a beat. His words, his touch, his gaze, they stirred something within her, a flicker of hope, a spark of trust. She was still afraid, terrified, but she was no longer alone. He was there, this enigmatic werewolf, this creature of darkness, offering her his protection, his guidance. But you said you were the one who would take me, she reminded him, her voice trembling, her mind struggling to reconcile his earlier words with his current actions. You said I was marked for the hunt. He nodded, his expression somber. You are, he said. But the hunt is not what you think it is. It's not about killing, about sacrificing. It's about embracing your true nature, about connecting with the wild, about becoming who you were meant to be. He paused, his gaze searching her face, as if gauging her reaction, her willingness to believe him. I am bound to protect the marked ones, he continued, his voice low and resonant. To guide them, to help them through the transformation, to keep them safe from those who would harm them. He squeezed her hand gently, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. I am your hunter, Talia, he said, his voice filled with a strange mixture of tenderness and possessiveness. But I am also your protector, your guide, and perhaps something more. The last word hung between them, a subtle, unspoken promise. Chapter 11. Sanctuary in Ruins. The unspoken promise hung heavy in the air, a fragile thread of connection between Talia and the hunter, a spark of something more than just protector and protected. The weight of his words, the intensity of his gaze, sent a shiver down her spine, a confusing mix of fear and a strange, undeniable attraction. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. Her injured ankle protested, but he supported her weight, his arm around her waist, his body close to hers. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, the strength in his muscles, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. We need to go, he said, his voice low and urgent, his gaze scanning the surrounding forest. It's not safe here. Talia nodded, her mind still reeling from the events of the night, from the revelations that had shattered her perception of reality. She trusted him, instinctively, despite the danger he represented, despite the fear that still lingered in her heart. He had saved her life, twice now, and she knew, somehow, that he wouldn't let any harm come to her. He led her through the darkness, his pace slow and deliberate, accommodating her injured ankle. The mist had thinned slightly, revealing a landscape that was both familiar and alien. They were no longer in the woods surrounding Havenwood, but in a wilder, more desolate place, a place where the veil between worlds seemed thin and fragile. The trees were ancient, their branches gnarled and twisted, their roots reaching deep into the earth. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and a strange, almost palpable energy that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. They walked in silence, the only sounds their footsteps on the uneven ground and the rustling of the leaves. Talia leaned on him, her body weary, her mind exhausted. She was grateful for his support, his strength, his presence. As they walked, she stole glances at him, studying his profile in the faint moonlight. He was undeniably handsome, his features strong and defined, his dark hair falling around his face. He was a creature of two worlds, a man and a beast, a hunter and a protector. She wondered about his life, his past, his experiences. She wanted to know more about him, about the world he inhabited, the world she was now a part of. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached their destination, a clearing in the forest, dominated by the ruins of an ancient stone structure. It looked like a church, or perhaps a cathedral, its walls crumbling, its roof long gone, its windows gaping holes in the darkness. "What is this place?" Talia asked, her voice hushed, her eyes wide with wonder and apprehension. "It's a sanctuary," he replied, his voice low and resonant. "A place of power, a place where we will be safe for a time." He led her through the ruined entrance, into the heart of the structure. The interior was open to the sky, the moonlight illuminating the crumbling walls, the overgrown floor, the remnants of what had once been a sacred space. There was a strange beauty to the ruins, a sense of history, of mystery, of forgotten magic. Talia felt a sense of peace here, a sense of belonging, despite the danger that still lurked outside. He guided her to a sheltered corner, where a thick layer of moss and leaves provided a makeshift bed. He helped her sit down, his touch gentle and reassuring. "Rest," he said, his voice soft, his golden eyes filled with concern. "You need to regain your strength." Talia nodded, her eyelids heavy, her body aching. She leaned back against the cold stone wall, closing her eyes, and allowed herself to drift into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of golden eyes and the shadows of the hunt. The hunter remained on guard, and in her drifting state, she was soothed by the even tenor of his breathing and the ever-present scent of him nearby. She was starting to feel secure when the distant baying began. Chapter 12. The Price of Protection. The distant baying, mournful and chilling, pierced through Talia's fitful sleep, jolting her awake. Her heart leaped into her throat, her body instantly tensing, every nerve ending on high alert. The sound, though faint, was unmistakable, the hounds of the hunt, a terrifying reminder of the danger that still pursued them. She sat up, her eyes wide with fear, her gaze darting around the ruined sanctuary. The hunter was still there, standing near the entrance, his body silhouetted against the faint moonlight, his senses on high alert, listening intently. He was a sentinel, a guardian, his presence a reassuring bulwark against the encroaching darkness. He turned his head, his golden eyes meeting hers. His expression was grim, his jaw set, but there was also a flicker of something else in his gaze, a determination, a resolve, that calmed her racing heart. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice trembling, her throat constricted with fear. He nodded, his voice low and steady. "I know," he said, "but they won't find us here. Not easily." He moved towards her, his footsteps silent on the moss-covered floor. He knelt beside her, his hand reaching out to gently touch her cheek, his touch sending a shiver down her spine, a strange mix of fear and comfort. "This place is protected," he explained, his voice a low murmur, his breath warm on her face. "By ancient magic. By the spirits of those who came before us." He gestured towards the crumbling walls, the overgrown floor, the remnants of what had once been a sacred space. This was a place of worship, he said. A place where the veil between worlds was thin. A place where the wild things could roam freely. He paused, his gaze searching her face, as if trying to gauge her understanding, her acceptance of the supernatural world, she had been thrust into. The hounds, they are drawn to the power of the marked ones, he continued. To your power, Talia. But this place, it masks that power.
It confuses them.
It makes it difficult for them to find you. Talia nodded, her mind struggling to grasp the concept of ancient magic, of spirits, of a world beyond the mundane, the rational. But she trusted him, instinctively, and she believed him. He had proven himself to be her protector, her guide, and she had no choice but to rely on him. But for how long? She asked, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his. How long will we be safe here? He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly, the weight of responsibility evident in his posture. I don't know, he admitted, his voice honest and devoid of any false reassurance. It depends on how strong their leader is, how determined they are to find you. He paused, his gaze locking with hers, his eyes filled with a fierce intensity. But I promise you, Talia, he said, his voice low and resonant, his words carrying the weight of a solemn vow, I will protect you, with my life if necessary. His words, his promise, sent a wave of emotion through her gratitude, relief, and a strange, unsettling sense of connection. She was still afraid, terrified, but she was no longer alone. He was there, this enigmatic werewolf, this creature of darkness, offering her his protection, his strength, his very life. He stood up, his body tensing, his senses on high alert. Rest now, he said, his voice firm but gentle. I'll keep watch. He moved back towards the entrance, his silhouette a dark, imposing figure against the faint moonlight. Talia watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. He was her protector, her guardian, and she knew, somehow, that she could trust him, completely. She lay back down, closing her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The baying of the hounds, though distant, still echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked outside. She was trapped, caught in a web of ancient forces she didn't understand, with no escape in sight. But she was not alone. He would be the first line of defense, she knew, a fierce protector, and a glimmer of warmth spread through her. That's when she decided that she needed to know his name. Chapter 13. Whispers of Rebellion. The warmth that had bloomed, a fragile bud of trust and something akin to security, settled in Talia's chest. It was a strange comfort, considering her circumstances, trapped in ancient ruins, hunted by supernatural creatures, and protected by a werewolf. Yet, the hunter's presence, his unwavering vigilance, his quiet strength, provided an anchor in the storm that raged around her. She needed to know his name. It felt essential, a way to solidify the connection between them, to acknowledge the bond that was forming, forged in fear and sealed with a whispered promise. She sat up, her gaze fixed on a silhouette against the moonlight filtering through the ruined entrance. He stood there, a statue of watchful intensity, his senses attuned to the slightest sound, the faintest scent, a guardian against the encroaching darkness. Hunter? She called out, her voice soft, hesitant, barely a whisper above the rustling of the leaves and the distant, mournful baying of the hounds. He turned his head, his golden eyes meeting hers. His expression was unreadable, his features shadowed, but she could sense his alertness, his readiness.
What is it?
He asked, his voice low and guarded, his tone neutral. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Do you have a name, don't you? She asked, her voice trembling slightly, her gaze searching his face.
I mean a real name.
Not just Hunter. He paused, his expression shifting, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features. He seemed surprised by her question, as if it was something unexpected, something he hadn't considered.
Why?
He asked, his voice still guarded, his eyes searching hers. Talia hesitated, unsure how to explain the sudden, urgent need to know his name. It felt important, essential, but she couldn't quite articulate why. Because you're not just a hunter, she stammered, her voice faltering, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. You're protecting me. You're a person. And people have names. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down her spine. It was a sound that held both amusement and a hint of something else, something softer, more vulnerable. "You are a curious creature, Talia Corvin," he said, his voice losing some of its guardedness, his tone softening. He turned fully towards her, stepping out of the shadows, the moonlight illuminating his features. He was undeniably handsome, his face strong and defined, his dark hair falling around his face, his golden eyes filled with a depth of emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "My name," he said, his voice low and resonant, his gaze holding hers, is Reese. Reese. The name resonated with her, a strong, evocative name that suited him, a name that felt both ancient and timeless. It was a name that spoke of strength, of wildness, of mystery. "Reese," she repeated, her voice soft, testing the sound of it on her tongue. It felt right, fitting, a key unlocking a new level of understanding between them. He smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face, making him seem less intimidating, more approachable. It was a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, softening the intensity of his gaze. "And you, Talia Corvin," he said, his voice playful, his eyes twinkling, "are full of surprises." Talia returned his smile, a small, hesitant smile, but a genuine one nonetheless. A warmth spread through her, a feeling of connection, of trust, that eased the fear that still lingered in her heart. I suppose I am," she admitted, her voice gaining strength, her confidence growing. She paused, her gaze searching his face, her mind racing. She had so many questions, so much she wanted to know about him, about his world, about her own heritage. "Reese," she began, her voice hesitant, but determined, tell me about the hunt. About our kind." She needed to understand, not just to survive, but to find a reason. Chapter 14. Scars of the Soul. The request hung in the air, a bridge built between two disparate worlds, two souls intertwined by fate and circumstance. Talia's gaze was unwavering, a mixture of fear and determination shining in her eyes. She needed to understand, to grasp the reality of her situation, to find her place in this new, terrifying world. Reese studied her for a moment, his golden eyes searching her face, as if gauging her readiness, her strength. He seemed to be weighing his words, considering how much to reveal, how much she could handle. He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly, the weight of his past, his heritage, settling upon him. He moved towards her, sitting down beside her on the moss-covered floor, his body close to hers, but not touching. The scent of him, that familiar mix of pine, earth, and wildness, enveloped her, a strange comfort in the midst of the ancient ruins. "The hunt," he began, his voice low and resonant, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the crumbling walls, "is not a game, Talia. It's not a sport. It's a responsibility. A burden." He paused, his jaw clenching, his eyes flickering with a pain that went deeper than any physical wound. Talia sensed a story there, a history of loss and suffering, a past that had shaped him into the man, the werewolf he was today. "We are the descendants of the Ancient Ones," he continued, his voice gaining strength, his tone filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Those who walked between worlds, who communed with the spirits of nature, who understood the balance between light and darkness." He turned to her, his golden eyes meeting hers, their intensity unwavering. "We are the guardians of that balance," he said, "the protectors of the wild, the ones who stand between the mortal world and the forces that would seek to disrupt it." He paused again, his gaze searching her face, as if trying to gauge her reaction, her understanding. "But we are not immune to those forces," he said, his voice softening, his eyes clouding with a sadness that touched Talia's heart. "We are vulnerable, just like anyone else. We can be tempted, corrupted, seduced by the darkness." He looked down at his hands, his fingers clenching and unclenching, as if struggling to control his emotions. Talia saw the scars there, not just on his hands, but on his soul, the marks of battles fought, of losses endured, of a life lived on the edge between two worlds. The hunt, he continued, his voice barely a whisper, is a constant struggle. A struggle against those who would exploit our power, who would use it for their own selfish purposes. A struggle against the darkness within ourselves. He looked up at her, his golden eyes filled with a plea for understanding, for acceptance. We are not monsters, Talia, he said, his voice raw with emotion. We are flawed. We are broken. But we are trying. We are fighting. To protect the balance. To protect the innocent. To protect you. His words resonated with Talia, touching her deeply. She saw the pain in his eyes, the burden he carried, the scars he bore. She understood, on some level, the struggle he faced, the constant battle between his human and his wolf nature. She reached out, her hand gently touching his arm, her fingers brushing against his skin. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a strange, unsettling sensation that made her heart skip a beat. I believe you, Reese, she said, her voice soft but firm, her gaze unwavering. I see the good in you. I see the man beneath the beast. He looked away, a shadow passing between them again. Chapter 15. The Heart's Reckoning. Reese looked away, a shadow passing over his face, obscuring the brief flicker of vulnerability Talia had glimpsed. The contact, the warmth of her hand on his arm, her words of acceptance, they had stirred something within him, something he had long suppressed, something he had believed to be lost forever. He was accustomed to fear, to mistrust, to the wary distance people kept from him, from the beast within. Her simple act of faith, her willingness to see beyond the monster, was a balm to his scarred soul, but also a source of profound unease. He pulled his arm away, gently but firmly, breaking the contact. He couldn't afford to be vulnerable, to be distracted. He had a duty, a responsibility, to protect her, and that required focus, clarity, detachment. Don't be fooled, Talia, he said, his voice hardening, his tone regaining its guardedness. The beast is always there, lurking beneath the surface. It's a part of me, a part of who I am. And it's dangerous. He stood up, moving away from her, putting distance between them. He paced the small space within the ruined sanctuary, his movements restless, agitated, like a caged animal. I've seen what I can do, he continued, his voice low and strained, his gaze fixed on the crumbling walls. I've felt the rage, the bloodlust, the uncontrollable urge to hunt, to kill. It's a constant battle, a struggle to maintain control, to keep the beast in check. He stopped pacing, turning to face her, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of self-loathing and a desperate plea for understanding. You shouldn't trust me, Talia, he said, his voice raw with emotion. You should be afraid of me. Talia watched him, her heart aching for the pain she saw in his eyes, the burden he carried. She understood his fear, his self-doubt, his struggle to reconcile his two natures. But she also saw the good in him, the compassion, the protectiveness, the man beneath the beast. She stood up, her injured ankle protesting, but she ignored the pain. She walked towards him, slowly, deliberately, closing the distance he had created between them. I am afraid, she admitted, her voice soft but firm, her gaze unwavering. But not of you, Reese. Of what's out there, of what they want to do to me, of the darkness that threatens to consume us all. She stopped just a few feet away from him, her eyes searching his face, her hand reaching out, hesitantly, towards him. I see your scars, Reese, she said, her voice filled with compassion, with understanding. I see your pain, but I also see your strength, your courage, your humanity. She touched his cheek, her fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw, the rough stubble of his beard. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through both of them, a spark of connection that defied the fear, the danger, the darkness that surrounded them. He closed his eyes, his body trembling slightly, as if struggling to control his emotions, to resist the pull of her touch, the warmth of her presence. Don't, he whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes still closed. Don't get close to me. It's not safe. Talia ignored his plea, her hand remaining on his cheek, her fingers moving softly, caressing his skin. "I'm already close, Reese," she said, her voice soft and gentle, her gaze unwavering. "We're bound together, by the hunt, by fate, by something more." She leaned in, her body brushing against his, her breath warm on his face. She looked into his eyes, her own filled with a mixture of fear and a growing, undeniable attraction. "And I'm not afraid," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her lips just inches from his. Her heart was pounding a primal rhythm. Chapter 16. Shadows of Doubt. Talia's heart pounded a primal rhythm, a frantic counterpoint to the slow, deliberate beat of Reese's own. Her words, her touch, her fearless proximity, they were a dangerous temptation, a siren song luring him towards a precipice he had long sworn to avoid. He wanted to pull away, to push her back, to reinforce the boundaries he had so carefully erected, but he couldn't. He was frozen, caught in the magnetic pull of her gaze, the warmth of her presence, the undeniable connection that sparked between them. He opened his eyes, his golden gaze meeting hers, locking with a force that stole his breath. He saw the fear in her eyes, yes, but also something else, a courage, a determination, a vulnerability that mirrored his own. And beneath it all, a flicker of desire, a spark of attraction that ignited a fire within him, a fire he had long thought extinguished. "Talia," he began, his voice a low, guttural rumble, a warning and a plea all in one. But she didn't let him finish. She closed the distance between them, her lips brushing against his, a tentative, fleeting touch that sent a shockwave through his entire body. It was a spark, a flame, a wildfire threatening to consume everything he had fought so hard to control. He groaned, a sound of both pleasure and pain, his hands instinctively reaching for her, his fingers tangling in her hair, pulling her closer. He deepened the kiss, his lips moving against hers with a hunger, a desperation, that surprised even himself. It was a kiss born of fear and desire, of loneliness and longing, of two souls reaching for connection in the midst of darkness. It was a mistake. He knew it, even as he lost himself in the sensation, in the taste of her, in the warmth of her body pressed against his. He was a danger to her, a threat, a creature of darkness, and she was light. Hope. A chance at redemption he didn't deserve. He broke the kiss, abruptly, tearing himself away from her, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling with the force of his suppressed emotions. He took a step back, putting distance between them, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "No," he said, his voice harsh and strained, his golden eyes filled with a turmoil of conflicting emotions. "We can't, this is wrong. It's dangerous." Talia looked at him, her eyes wide and confused, her lips still parted from the kiss, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of desire and hurt. She didn't understand, not fully, the danger he represented, the darkness that lurked within him. "But I thought," she stammered, her voice trembling, her hand reaching out towards him, then falling back to her side. "You thought what?" He challenged, his voice sharper than he intended, his tone defensive. "That I'm some kind of romantic hero? That I can be tamed? That I can be saved?" He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the floor, his shoulders slumping with the weight of his self-loathing. "I'm a monster, Talia," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A werewolf. A creature of the hunt. And I won't let you get caught in the crossfire." He turned away from her, his back to her, his body tense and rigid. He couldn't bear to see the disappointment, the hurt in her eyes. He couldn't bear to face the truth of his own feelings, the undeniable attraction he felt for her, the longing for a connection he knew he could never have. "Stay away from me, Talia," he said, his voice cold and distant, a deliberate attempt to push her away, to protect her from himself. "For your own good." He walked away, towards the entrance of the ruined sanctuary, leaving her alone in the shadows, his words a cruel blow that shattered the fragile bond that had begun to form between them. A sob escaped her. Chapter 17. The Gathering Storm. A sob escaped Talia, a choked sound of pain and confusion that echoed in the silent ruins. Reese's rejection, his harsh words, his deliberate cruelty, they had struck her like a physical blow, shattering the fragile hope that had begun to bloom within her. She had offered him her trust, her vulnerability, her heart, and he had thrown it back in her face. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill that had settled over her, a coldness that went deeper than the damp air of the ancient sanctuary. She was alone again, adrift in a world of darkness and danger, with no one to rely on but herself. She didn't understand. She had seen the good in him, the compassion, the protectiveness, the man beneath the beast. She had felt the connection between them, the spark of attraction, the undeniable pull that had drawn them together. Why was he pushing her away? Why was he so determined to deny what was happening between them? Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision, but she blinked them back, refusing to give in to despair.
She was stronger than that.
She had survived loss, heartbreak, and the quiet loneliness of her life in Havenwood. She would survive this, too. She stood up, her injured ankle protesting, but she ignored the pain. She walked towards the entrance of the ruins, where Reese stood, his back to her, his silhouette a dark, imposing figure against the faint pre-dawn light. She stopped a few feet away from him, her gaze fixed on his back, her voice trembling but firm. "Reese," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the stillness. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence. He remained rigid, his body tense, his silence a wall between them. "I don't understand," she continued, her voice gaining strength, her determination growing. "Why are you doing this? Why are you pushing me away?" He finally turned, his golden eyes meeting hers, his expression a mask of cold indifference, a stark contrast to the passionate man who had kissed her just moments before. "I told you," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, his tone flat and distant. "It's for your own good."
I'm dangerous, Talia.
"I'm a monster. And you need to stay away from me." "But you saved my life," she protested, her voice rising in frustration.
Twice.
"You protected me from that hunter, from the hounds. You said you were bound to protect the marked ones." He scoffed, a harsh, cynical sound that made her flinch. "Duty," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Obligation. It's not about you, Talia. It's about the hunt, about maintaining the balance, about following orders." His words were like a slap in the face, a cruel dismissal of the connection she had felt between them, the bond she had believed was forming. "Orders?" she repeated, her voice incredulous, her eyes searching his face. "From whom? Who gives you orders?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features. He seemed to be struggling with himself, battling an internal conflict that she couldn't understand. "It doesn't matter," he said finally, his voice evasive, his tone dismissive. "What matters is that you stay away from me, that you go back to your life, to your normalcy, and forget you ever met me." He turned away from her again, his back to her, his body rigid. "Go, Talia," he said, his voice cold and final. "Leave this place. And don't look back." The sky outside began to lighten, and a crack of thunder broke the stalemate. Chapter 18. A choice between worlds. The crack of thunder, sharp and sudden, reverberated through the ruined sanctuary, a dramatic punctuation mark to Teresa's harsh dismissal. The sky outside, previously a canvas of soft, pre-dawn grays, was now rapidly darkening, bruised with the purple and black of an approaching storm. The wind picked up, whipping through the crumbling walls, carrying with it the scent of rain and a palpable sense of foreboding. Talia stood there, frozen, her heart aching with a mixture of pain, anger, and a profound sense of loss. His words, his rejection, had cut her deeply, but beneath the hurt, a flicker of defiance ignited within her. She had been passive for too long, accepting her fate, allowing others to dictate her life. But no more. "No," she said, her voice firm and resolute, cutting through the rising wind. Reese didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence. He remained rigid, his back to her, his silence a wall between them, seemingly impervious to her defiance. "I won't go," She continued, her voice gaining strength, her determination growing with each word. I won't go back to my old life, to my normalcy. That life is gone, Reese. Shattered. The moment I heard those horns, the moment I saw you, everything changed. She took a step closer, her injured ankle protesting, but she ignored the pain. She needed to make him understand, to break through the wall he had erected around himself. You can't just dismiss me, Reese, she said, her voice rising above the wind. You can't just pretend that nothing happened between us. We're connected, whether you like it or not. By the hunt, by fate, by something more. He finally turned, his golden eyes meeting hers, his expression a mixture of anger, frustration, and a flicker of something else, something that looked almost like fear. Don't be a fool, Talia, he said, his voice harsh and strained, his tone laced with desperation. You don't understand the danger you're in. You don't understand what I am. I understand more than you think, she retorted, her voice unwavering, her gaze locked with his. I understand that you're scared, Reese. Scared of yourself, scared of your power, scared of letting anyone get close. She took another step closer, closing the distance between them, her body almost touching his. But I'm not afraid of you, Reese, she said, her voice softer now, but still firm. I'm not afraid of the beast.
Because I see the man beneath.
And I know that he's worth fighting for. She reached out, her hand gently touching his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the rough stubble of his beard. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through both of them, a spark of connection that defied the fear, the danger, the storm that raged around them. He closed his eyes, his body trembling slightly, as if struggling to control his emotions, to resist the pull of her touch, the warmth of her presence. You don't know what you're asking, Talia, he whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes still closed. I'm asking you to let me in, Reese, she said, her voice soft and gentle, her gaze unwavering.
To trust me.
To let me help you. To let us face this together. The storm broke, rain lashing down, the wind howling through the ruins, thunder echoing around them like a battle cry. Talia stood firm, her hand on his cheek, her gaze locked with his, offering him a choice, a chance to step out of the shadows, to embrace the light, to face the future, not alone, but together.
He had a choice.
Her or them. Chapter 19. The Dance of Destiny. He had a choice.
Her or them.
The words echoed in Reese's mind, a stark and terrifying ultimatum. Talia, standing before him, her hand on his cheek, her eyes filled with a mixture of courage, determination, and a love he didn't deserve, represented everything he had longed for, everything he had denied himself for so long: connection, acceptance, a chance at redemption. Them, the shadowy figures who controlled his life, the masters of the hunt, represented duty, obligation, a life of servitude and darkness, a path he had walked for centuries, a path he had believed was his only option. The storm raged around them, mirroring the turmoil within him, the battle between his heart and his duty, his desire and his fear. The rain lashed down, soaking them both to the bone, the wind howling through the ruins, thunder echoing like the drums of war. He opened his eyes, his golden gaze meeting hers, locking with a force that stole his breath. He saw the trust in her eyes, the unwavering belief in him, the offer of a future he had never dared to dream of. And in that moment, the choice became clear. He reached up, his hand covering hers, his fingers intertwining with hers, a silent vow, a commitment. He pulled her closer, his body pressing against hers, sheltering her from the storm, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was both desperate and tender, a kiss that sealed their fate, a kiss that defied the darkness. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and tears, of fear and hope, of a love that was both forbidden and inevitable. It was a kiss that said, I choose you. He broke the kiss, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest, a wild, untamed rhythm that matched the storm. He looked into her eyes, his own filled with a mixture of love, determination, and a fierce protectiveness. They'll come for us, he said, his voice low and urgent, his gaze searching her face. They won't give up. They'll hunt us to the ends of the earth. Talia nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and excitement, her hand tightening around his. I know, she said, her voice unwavering. But we'll face them together. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that transformed his face, making him seem younger, more hopeful, more human. Together, he repeated, his voice filled with a newfound strength, a resolve that banished the shadows of doubt. He pulled away from her, his hand still holding hers, his gaze sweeping the ruined sanctuary, his mind racing, formulating a plan. We need to leave this place, he said, his voice decisive, his tone commanding. It's no longer safe. They know we're here. Talia nodded, her trust in him absolute, her willingness to follow him unquestioning. He led her out of the ruins, into the heart of the storm, the rain plastering their clothes to their bodies, the wind whipping their hair around their faces. They were running, not from the hunt, but towards their future, a future uncertain, dangerous, but filled with a love that defied the darkness, a love that was worth fighting for. They were running, hand in hand, two souls intertwined by fate, two worlds colliding, a werewolf and a woman marked for the hunt, embarking on a journey that would test their strength, their courage, and their love, a journey that would determine not only their own destiny, but the fate of the world. A howl pierced the rain, but this time it sounded like his. Chapter 20. The Final Confrontation of Hearts. A howl pierced the rain, but this time it sounded like Reese's, a primal cry of defiance, a challenge to the forces that sought to control them, a declaration of love and loyalty. It was a sound that echoed through the storm-ravaged landscape, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. They ran hand in hand through the flooded forest, the terrain treacherous, the visibility near zero. Reese, guided by instinct and his heightened senses, led the way, his strength and speed a reassuring presence, a shield against the elements and the unseen dangers that lurked in the shadows. Talia, despite her injured ankle and her lack of supernatural abilities, kept pace, her determination fueled by her love for Reese, her refusal to be a victim, her commitment to fight for their future. The storm intensified, the rain lashing down with unrelenting force, the wind howling like a banshee, the thunder cracking overhead like the wrath of an angry god. It was as if nature itself was mirroring the conflict that raged within them, the battle between love and duty, between freedom and servitude, between light and darkness. They reached a cliff overlooking a raging river, the water a churning torrent of whitecaps and debris. The wind tore at them, threatening to rip them from their footing, the rain blinding them, the sheer drop a terrifying reminder of the stakes. We need to cross, Reese shouted above the roar of the storm, his voice strained, his gaze fixed on the opposite bank, a sliver of land barely visible through the driving rain. Talia nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, her fear battling with her trust in Reese. The river was a raging monster, a death trap, but she knew they had no choice. They couldn't go back. They had to keep moving forward. Reese turned to her, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of love, concern, and a fierce determination. Hold on tight, he said, his voice low and urgent. And don't let go. He shifted, his body transforming, the familiar ripple of muscle and bone, the lengthening of limbs, the sprouting of fur, the terrifying and beautiful metamorphosis into his werewolf form. He was a creature of power, of primal instinct, of untamed wildness, a magnificent and terrifying sight against the backdrop of the storm. Talia didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. She had seen his true form before, had witnessed his savagery, but she was no longer afraid. She trusted him, implicitly, with her life, with her heart, with her soul. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers clinging to his thick fur, her body pressing against his, seeking warmth and reassurance in his powerful embrace. He leaped, a breathtaking display of strength and agility, launching them both into the raging torrent, the cold water engulfing them, the current pulling at them, threatening to tear them apart. The crossing was a blur of terror and adrenaline, a struggle for survival against the overwhelming power of nature. Rhys fought against the current, his powerful muscles straining, his claws finding purchase on the slippery rocks, his determination unwavering. Talia held on tight, her eyes squeezed shut, her body battered by the waves, her lungs burning for air. They reached the opposite bank, collapsing onto the muddy ground, exhausted, soaked, and shivering, but alive. They had made it. They had survived. But the respite was brief. As they lay there, gasping for breath, they heard the baying of the hounds, closer now, much closer, and the chilling sound of human voices, filled with malice and intent. The hunt had caught up with them. Rhys rose to his feet, shifting back into his human form, his body tense and ready, his golden eyes scanning the surrounding forest, his hand reaching for the hunting knife sheathed at his hip. He looked at Talia with an expression of pleading, his heart heavy as he realized the finality of their situation. "Stay behind me," he said, and was promptly interrupted. From the shadows, figures emerged, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred. They were the hunters, the masters of the hunt, the ones who had controlled Rhys's life for centuries, the ones who sought to claim Talia's power. The leader stepped forward, a tall, imposing figure with a cruel smile and eyes that burned with a fanatical light. "It's over, Rhys," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You can't run anymore. You can't hide. The girl is ours." The final battle had begun. Epilogue. The final battle had begun. A clash of wills, a collision of worlds, a desperate struggle for survival and freedom. Rhys stood between Talia and the hunters, his body a shield, his heart a fortress, his love for her a weapon more powerful than any blade or spell. He was outnumbered, outmatched, but he would not yield. He would fight to his last breath to protect her, to defy his former masters, to claim their right to a future together. Talia, despite her fear, stood tall, her hand reaching for Rhys's, their fingers intertwining, a silent vow of unity, of strength, of unwavering love. She was no longer the passive, frightened woman who had fled into the darkness. She was a warrior, a survivor, a woman who had embraced her heritage, her power, her connection to the wild. The leader of the hunters, a man named Valerius, sneered at them, his eyes filled with contempt and a cruel amusement. "Foolish," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you can defy us, Rhys? You think you can escape your destiny? You are ours, both of you. You belong to the hunt." Rhys met his gaze, his golden eyes burning with defiance, his voice ringing out clear and strong above the roar of the storm. "I belong to no one," he said. "And neither does Talia. We're free, and we will choose our own destiny." The battle was joined, a whirlwind of violence and magic, of claws and blades, of snarls and screams. Rhys fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, his movements swift and deadly, his strength amplified by his love for Talia, his desperation to protect her. He tore through the hunters, his claws and fangs ripping flesh and bone, his rage a terrifying force. Talia, though lacking Rhys's supernatural abilities, fought with a courage and determination that surprised even herself. She used her small silver knife, the gift from Daniel, to defend herself, her movements guided by instinct, her will fueled by her love for Rhys. But the hunters were many, and they were powerful. They pressed their attack, their numbers overwhelming, their magic a dark and insidious force. Rhys was wounded, his body bleeding, his strength failing, but he fought on, his eyes fixed on Talia, his love for her his shield and his weapon. Valerius, seeing his opportunity, lunged at Talia, his hand reaching for her, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "The power will be mine," he shouted, his voice filled with a mad glee. But Talia was ready. As Valerius reached for her, she felt it a surge of energy, a rush of power, the awakening of the wildness within her. Her eyes glowed with an unearthly light, her body trembled with the force of the transformation, and she unleashed a scream, a primal cry that shook the very foundations of the earth. The scream was not just a sound, but a force, a wave of energy that ripped through the hunters, throwing them back, shattering their weapons, disrupting their magic. Valerius was caught in the blast, his body lifted from the ground, his eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Talia stood there, transformed, not into a werewolf, but into something else, something ancient and powerful, a manifestation of the wild, a guardian of the balance, a true descendant of the Corvin line. She turned to Rhys, her eyes filled with love and a fierce determination. Together, they finished the fight, their combined power overwhelming the remaining hunters, driving them back into the shadows, breaking their hold on the hunt forever. The storm subsided, the rain softening to a drizzle, the clouds parting to reveal a sky filled with stars. The world was at peace. The balance had been restored. Rhys and Talia, hand in hand, stood on the cliff overlooking the river, the water now calm and reflective, mirroring the starry sky above. They were wounded, exhausted, but they were alive. They were free. They were together. They had chosen their own destiny. They built a life for themselves, away from Havenwood, away from the shadows of the past, in a place where they could be together, where they could embrace their true natures, where they could love each other without fear or reservation. It was a life filled with challenges, with dangers, but also with joy, with companionship, with a love that defied the darkness, a love that was stronger than any curse, any destiny, any force that sought to control them. They explored Talia's powers, their intertwining magic, and lived, not just for themselves, but for the wild. They found a quiet peace in the love they had found, and the long years stretched ahead. The wild was in them, and they were free. The end.